like I said, you had these three networks, along with syndication, that helped, but mostly these three main networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS, helped to complete the construction of that foundation, complete construction of that building, and have it open for business. And like I said, the 50s were where the blueprints were drawn up, and the ground was broken, and the groundwork was laid down. The 60s was when you started to put more foundation on that groundwork. You started to lay out, you started to put the cement and everything. You started to put that down. The 70s where you were starting to really solidify and fortify the building. You started to put up those steel bars and whatever you call them. The steel bars and stuff in wood. You started to put the strengthening. You started to strengthen it around. You started to put the skeleton together, if you will, to really strengthen what this was going to be. And in the 80s is when it was open, it was ready to go. Like I say, the 60s was when you were putting down the cement. You were starting to put up those barriers. You started to put, not barriers, but you started to put up that foundation on top of the groundwork, or after it was broken. The 70s is when you started to really solidify it. You started to really fortify the strength of that building, of that creation of yours. And then when 80s came, it was just like I said. It was just like I said in the first video, when the Walmart opened here in Patterson. The day it finally opened, that's kind of like how Saturday mornings were. Basically, bam, the door was just broken down. It was just broken right down. Or just, no, not broken down, but basically bursted, was basically opened wide for what Saturday mornings were in the 80s. And again, like I said, cartoons during the weekdays during the 80s, they were nothing to be ashamed about either. But the networks of the major three networks at that time was the place to be on Saturday mornings. And like I said in the first video, one of the unique perspectives was any first or second Friday in September, they always dedicated a half hour of the Friday night block to previewing, if you will, to previewing what was going to come that following morning, that following Saturday morning. That's basically what it was. And I'll tell you, being a kid that grew up in the 80s, it was worth it. It really was. And I'll tell you why. Because throughout that decade, every year you had almost hit after hit after hit after hit after hit. And you had all these different companies, all these different animation companies, major or independent, that were selling and having their products aired on the different networks almost simultaneously. Almost at the same time. Disney, for example, in the 80s, in the early to mid 80s, they had basically three major shows that they had airing. They had Gummy Bears, Winnie the Pooh, and the Wuzzles. And here's where the variety of this came in. You had Disney basically working with NBC by having them broadcast the Gummy Bears. You had them working with ABC by broadcasting Winnie the Pooh. You had them working with CBS by having them broadcast the Wuzzles. What more could you ask for? And then you had shows like, let's say, trying to find here, shows that even I didn't know about because I was too young. I was just a baby at the time. Some I did know, some I didn't. Like, let's say you had the Flintstone Kids. The Flintstone Kids, along with the Muppet Babies at that time, and a pup named Scooby-Doo. These three shows basically were mostly Muppet Babies, and then also thanks to the Flintstone Kids, were basically the starting blocks for what was known as the baby-fied teenage debut or era for some of the major characters, some of these major franchise characters. I mean, after you had Muppet Babies, a few years later, here comes Flintstone's Kids. A few years later after that, here comes a pup named Scooby-Doo. And then how do you end that? You end it with Yo Yogi in the 1990s. Again, it was just like you could not believe what you were seeing, even with these Saturday morning cartoons. And then, of course, you had shows like, you had shows like The Biscuits, you had Galatar, art, if you will. You had Thundar, you had Dragon Slayer, a cartoon based on Dragon Slayer. You had Mr. T, you had Chuck Norris cartoon. You had a lot of stuff during Saturday mornings that you never thought you would see. And some of these shows, I will admit, only lasted a season because they weren't that good. But perhaps in the ratings. But even still, they're part of Saturday morning cartoon history, and they're part of that Renaissance era during the 80s of Saturday morning cartoons. I mean, you had shows in there. You had shows in there like the Flintstone Kids. You had a show based on Beetlejuice in the late 80s. You had that. You had, my God, you had the Smurfs. You had, God, I can't believe, you had Kissy Fur on NBC. You had the Bearstein Bears, Hulk Hogan's Rockin' Wrestling. You had the Young Astronauts. Hell, I got comic book issues of Spider-Man back from the 80s. And when I look in them, you have advertisements of all these different shows. You had Rubik's. What else did you have? You had Alvin and the Chipmunks, of course. You had a Punky Brewster cartoon. I mean, you name it. Again, like you said, you had Bearstein Bears, Young Astronauts. The Bugs Bunny and Tweety show, the Bugs Bunny and Daffy show, whatever you want to call it back then. I mean, the list just goes on and on of shows you had during Saturday mornings. And Saturday mornings was basically the time. And here's what was special about it. Yeah, like I said before, weekday cartoons in the mornings and afternoons of the weekdays and even Sunday mornings were great. There's no doubt. You had a great variety. You had a great variety during those times. I'm not denying that. I'm not denying that because I should know. I would wake up every morning before I went to school to try to watch what I could. I would come home after I did some homework, if I had any, and I would watch 2 hours worth of cartoons. I mean, I remember the block specifically on one network, on one syndicated channel during the weekdays, where G.I. Joe was something like, G.I. Joe, My Little Pony, or My Little Pony, G.I. Joe, Transformers, and Jump. I remember sometimes doing, I don't know if it was Sunday mornings or Saturday mornings, we tuned into syndication, and there was an hour's worth, just like they're trying to do right now with the Me TV syndicated channels. There used to be an hour's worth of Funimation, and the Funimation and the two cartoons from them were He-Man and She-Ra. I remember watching He-Man, and after it was done, I would probably go to my room or do something else, and my sisters would watch She-Ra. And later on, I would join them, and I would watch it too. And again, like I said, I'm not saying weekday afternoons and mornings and Sunday mornings didn't have a great variety. They did, but it was mostly Saturdays that was basically the catalyst. It was the king, if you will, of that Renaissance era of Saturday morning cartoons during the 80s. It was. Let me explain. You see, throughout the entire week, we would always, even during the summer, and this is where it really helped out, during the summer, you would always have all these different, as we would look at them, boring shows back in the day on all these networks. And all we would have is about 2 hours worth in the morning, 2 to 3 hours worth in the morning, in the afternoon, and that was it. Mostly 2 hours in the afternoon, and that was it. But when Saturday mornings came, the reason they were so special was because we had an entire Saturday morning from 7 a.m. to almost noon, or 11 a.m. at the earliest, and noon at the latest. We would have an entire Saturday morning block dedicated to us. And we would have it dedicated to us by all three of these networks. We would. Now, syndication also tried to give us a Saturday morning too, and they did. But their Saturday morning block wasn't as long as what you have with the networks, which was kind of ironic. Theirs was mainly, I think, around the standard 2 to 3 hours. We had a whole morning's worth. We had a whole morning's worth of Saturday morning cartoons that we could enjoy. You know, we had things like Pole Position. Like I said, we had the Biscuit, we had the Paw-Paws, we had the Star Wars cartoons like the Droids and the Ewoks. You know, we had all these shows. We had Funimation's, Ghostbusters. Then we had the real Ghostbusters. You know, we had all these different shows, and they were basically on for 5 to 6 hours. Now, depending on where you live, like nowadays, you'd have your Saturday mornings in the afternoon. In the afternoon, and that wouldn't help, but still, you'd be able to watch it if you could. And that is why because of this, because of the variety of stuff we had. I mean, we had Popeye cartoon, Popeye and Son cartoon, Pig Panther and Pals. You know, we had shows like, let me see here. Like I said, even shows that I didn't know of, like I mentioned earlier, like Goldie Gold and Action Jack. We had the Biscuits, I've heard of them. We had the Quickie Koala Show, I heard of that. And there were some shows that I didn't know about. Like Dream Chips Car Wash and Princess. Oh, never mind. That's the Flintstone Kids. They dominated this. Again, you just had stuff. You had the Muccinis or whatever. I mean, you just had a lot of variety, and that's what made it so special. That's what made it so special back in that time frame. That's what made it so special. And what was even more so is you had iconic ones like Scooby-Doo. You had, during the 80s, what many consider 3 of the best Scooby-Doo seasons ever, from All New Scooby-Doo and Scrappy, New Scooby-Doo Mysteries, and the 13 Ghosts. You had all that. And then you combine with whatever else you had, and that's what made Saturday morning so special to a lot of people. Made it so special, made it so unique. It made getting up early on Saturday mornings worth it. And yes, like I said, it carried on into the early to mid-90s and then slowly died off. But basically, the 80s, the Saturday mornings during the 80s was the Renaissance era. It was an impact. It wasn't a golden era. It wasn't just a golden era, if you will, a golden age. It was a Renaissance age. It was a Renaissance era. And that's why a lot of people look back at Saturday mornings and remember them with such fondness. A lot of people like me, because you take a look at now, and you have just a huge variety of different channels and stuff, and with a peripheral of shows that you can watch, but still, it's just mainly the same kind of shows you see during the weekdays, and that's what makes people kind of reminisce and long for the days of Saturday mornings, because you always had a different variety. You didn't have the same kind of shows you saw during the weekdays. You had shows that were just specifically made for Saturday mornings. And that's what made Saturday mornings special. And that is why people long for those days. I can only pray and hope that whoever recorded Saturday mornings back as a kid, if you still have a tape,